there, we're wrapping up the Quilty Chicks block of the month, and now that we've made all of our blocks, it's time to put them all together. The first step is going to be to cut all of these little spacing strips that we need, and I'm going to kind of walk you through it a little bit. It's pretty straightforward, but there's a few things that I want to point out. The first of which, we have this cutting diagram here, and for most of these, instead of cutting narrow strips and then subcutting them into longer strips, we're going to cut the length of the strip and then subcut that wide strip into narrower pieces. This is the most efficient way to cut the fabric and not have little bits and pieces left over. We're going to cut 3 14.5-inch strips and subcut them into a bunch of different widths, and refer to the pattern for that. Then we'll cut a 12.5-inch strip and subcut that into a bunch of narrow 2.5-inch strips. And then, because cutting another 12.5-inch strip would waste a big chunk of fabric, we're going to cut a couple 2.5-inch strips for space and make some spacing strips out of those, and an additional 2.5-inch strips that we'll use as a border. So there's that. Make sure when you're cutting, and you guys already know this, let's move this into the camera, but make sure when you're cutting to line up a line on the ruler with the fold mark at the top, and that will help your strips stay straight and not bow at the end. If you notice that this edge is getting curvy, just trim it back up until it's square. Just cut off a little 1/4 inch and keep going. All right, once you have a million different spacing strips cut, actually as you go, you really need to label them. Just get a little piece of paper, write down what size it is, pin them together so you're not fumbling around when you're doing the layout. With those all cut, you're going to refer to this page and do the final layout. You'll see all of the different widths of strips marked out here along with the chicken blocks. It is vitally important that you put the right width of strip in the right place, or else your rows are going to be different widths and it's just going to be a mess. You can switch any of the flowers with any of the other flowers. So for example, if you think based on the color or whatever's going on that this pinwheel star would look better over here and that this prairie flower would look better over here, you can switch them. That's okay. Same with the chickens. You can move the chickens all around. You can move this chicken up here, switch it with that chicken. Chickens are interchangeable with chickens and flowers are interchangeable with flowers, but you can't switch a chicken for a flower or else your row width is going to get all messed up. So just lay them all out on your design wall or on your floor or table. After you've laid everything out, take a step back, look at how the colors of your chickens and flowers are. Do you have like a lot of red here and then no red up here? I like to kind of make sure there's a good scattering of colors throughout the quilt. And also these cornerstones, it's fun to cut them out of scraps from the chickens so that you can also sprinkle those colors around. After you make sure everything's laid out how you want, you just sew together into rows. You're pressing towards the spacing strips. Sew the rows together, press towards the spacing strips. Easy peasy. And then I'm going to add the borders. Now, if all is perfect, your quilt top will measure the dimensions supposed to measure here in the pattern. It probably will not, like mine didn't. Like we've done a lot of sewing. It's gonna be off a little bit. So we're gonna measure the height of the quilt, and you can measure it in the middle, or you can measure it in the middle and two sides if you want to be super exact. Make sure it's all really flat and nice, and then average those measurements and cut your side strips to that length. This is a pain in the rear, but it makes everything turn out so much nicer. After you've set the seam, pressed, you'll measure the width of the quilt in 1 or 2 or 3 places, average those, cut this 2.5-inch strip to the size that you measured, sew onto both. I find it helpful to fold the border in half and just make a little crease there and line it up with the middle of my quilt top, line up the edges and just kind of pin in between to make sure that make sure that the border's even across the quilt. And then that's it. That's all. We are done. That is all that's left. And you'll have this beautiful quilt. You do need to bind it. So quilt it, bind it. I think this looks good with kind of swirly quilting. This one was a little chicken wire is what Lilo of Trace Creek Quilting did on my quilt. I also think clamshells or swirls would look great with this too. And if you're new to binding and basting and all that, I have a link to a printable basting and binding guide on my website that you can download, print for free, and get some direction on that. I am so glad that you guys have sewn along with me, that we've been able to make this quilt together, and I can't wait to see all of the beautiful chicken quilts that will be finished now. Thanks again for sewing along.